seminar, which is arranged by a project which has the acronym PopGen. PopGen stands for Population Whole Genome Sequencing, Implications for the Nordic Solidaristic Healthcare. This is a small project that is funded by, and now I will change into Scandinavian language, Nordisk Samarbejdsnævn for Humanistisk og Samfundsvidenskabelig Forskning, NOS-HS, som et samarbejdsorgan mellem forskningsrådene i Finland, Danmark, Island, Sverige og Norge med ansvar for humanistisk og samfundsvidenskabelig forskning. That is to say, this is a joint committee for Nordic research councils in the humanities and social sciences, and is a cooperative organ between the research councils in Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway and Sweden, responsible for research within the humanities and social sciences. And we are a group of people from Iceland and other Nordic countries and the Baltic countries as well. We come from within a Nordic network which is called the Nordic Network for Philosophy of Medicine and Medical Ethics, which has been meeting regularly since 2007, I think, or 2008. And we got funding for 3 exploratory workshops where we will be looking at the emerging technologies of whole genome association studies of whole populations and their ethical and social implications. That's the description in the application. And one of our sort of key words is all this talk about increased individual responsibility, empowerment of individuals in relation and management of their own health, and whether this discourse of individual responsibility may somehow erode or undermine our notions of joint responsibility, solidarity that has characterized our Nordic systems of healthcare. Now, yesterday morning there was a kick-off network meeting in PopGen. We were only 16 people there, representing all the Nordic and Baltic countries, where we were discussing the analytical framework and framing the sort of the focus of our project. And this is the second part of the PopGen project. In between, we had the meeting of the Nordic Bioethics Committee yesterday, and of course the whole thing was launched by an excellent lecture by Tim Caulfield, who will also comment here later today, or this morning. And we had in our description of PopGen that it would be an important part of the meeting here in Reykjavík, in our first kick-off meeting, that we would consult with Icelandic scientists and policymakers about genetic research and healthcare in Iceland. So we have invited 3 Icelandic scientists to give introductory lectures here today, and then we will have comments and general discussion. But first I will ask Professor Reynir Arngrímsson, who is an Associate Professor of Genetic Medicine at the University of Iceland, to take over as chair. Please.
I would like to start again by welcoming you all to Iceland. I come from the genetic background, as you see, but it's been a very delightful experience to come and listen to you and hear your perspectives of the progress in genetic research. And grateful as well for this seminar today. I think it's very important for the discussions we are having in Iceland about implication of genetic research and how to apply and the translation of basic science into practice. So I would like to start by reminding you of the objectives of the meeting, which is on your floor. It is the discussion about genetic research in Iceland and the progress of translating the findings into therapeutics and preventive strategies in clinical context. Emphasis will be on the ethical and social challenges that these developments may bring. So I think this is a big task, and I think we have the right crowd to address this here today. So I would like to start by welcoming Jóhannes Jónsson, who is the head of department of genetics and molecular medicine in the Landspítalinn, which is the university hospital, and also in the university he's the chair of the department of biochemistry and molecular biology.
Thank you, everybody. I'm grateful for the opportunity to address you today for this symposium, important symposium. My task was basically to describe the department we have here in the hospital, the Department of Genetics and Molecular Medicine. In that way, sort of set a background for where healthcare is at in general, but also specifically here in this country. And I won't be many slides here, so be assured. This department, Landspítalinn obviously being the only tertiary hospital in this country, and the Department of Genetics and Molecular Medicine is the only department of its kind in this country. It basically excuse me, has the task of offering comprehensive generic health services for the whole country. And sometimes this actually also involves servicing Icelanders living abroad if they have specific generic problems that we're familiar with in this country. We basically then, to offer a comprehensive genetic health service, one needs both specialized laboratories as well as a clinical genetics and a genetic counseling unit. So that's basically how we're organized. Besides the service work we do, we're also involved in teaching and research. We teach many of the health science students, biology students, and also interact with other student groups and other faculties at the university as the occasion may arise. We try to base our service on international guidelines. For the most part, we try to follow them as closely as we can, sometimes adapted to our specific conditions. These might be, for instance, advice and information that one can find in gene reviews. If anyone is interested in how, on a genetics of a specific condition, how that should be diagnosed and treated, this is an excellent source. And then we basically interact and participate in functions of the European Society of Human Genetics. And we also look towards the American and the American College of Medical Genetics in particular being an important source of information on how to deliver genetic health services. We, as all departments of this kind, we have multiple collaborations. Within the Landspítalinn, we basically interact with other departments within what's called the Division of Diagnostic Medicine. And this basically is the clinical laboratories and radiology. We collaborate with obstetrics. A lot of the generic services have to do with reproductive issues, prenatal screening and diagnosis, issues with recurrent abortions, etc. Oncology is also an important partner, specifically when it relates to cancer genetic counseling. Pediatrics, don't need to mention that really, because many of the genetic conditions manifest themselves in the pediatric population, although no age range is really free of genetic conditions or presentations of genetic conditions. Now within the, and I should really have added there, surgery, because we, as Vigdís will explain to you, we collaborate with the Department of Surgery on, for instance, breast cancer surveillance. This is by no means a complete list. More examples. Within the University of Iceland, the Landspítalinn, our hospital, and University of Iceland, they have multiple collaborations on teaching and research, and we participate in that, including with joint appointments of several individuals in the department, and also by offering facilities for teaching in terms of the advanced hospitality. And then we have various other local and international collaborations, including with both Decode and the Icelandic heart prevention. So whatever it takes to help us deliver our services. Now the university has a similar arrangement as a School of Health Sciences, Faculty of Medicine, and within that is the Department of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology, which has the task of teaching and doing basic research, basically in the disciplines of biochemistry, molecular biology, of genetics, but also in the applications of these disciplines in healthcare. So that department is then affiliated with the Department of Genetics and Molecular Medicine, as well as the Department of Clinical Biochemistry. Now we're a new department, perhaps indicating that genetics is a new and growing branch of health services. So when we were formed, all the buildings had long been built. So unfortunately, I guess, because right now we're then basically placed in various different locations. Actually, we're now in 5 buildings. And I have listed some of them here. Needless to say, since we're also a rather small department, we only have 25 members, this makes many of our tasks more difficult. For the longest time, I thought we were perhaps the smallest genetics department in the world. And I know now that that actually is not the case. Linköping in Sweden actually only has 8 members. So, but they don't have the same comprehensive genetic health service task that we do. So I still think very few departments with this comprehensive service task have this few members, and obviously that also makes life at times strenuous, especially now in light of all the growth and increased complexity that we have to deal with. So one of the things is that we cannot really wait for this new hospital. We really are very eager to have that built. I can maybe. So right now we're basically placed. We're here. We have an office here. We have also one of our laboratories right here. And this is going to be the new hospital here with the care facility here. The main hospital really, and this is going to be the new clinical laboratories division, and this is going to be the university teaching and research buildings. So we're very keen on having this up and running, whenever that may be. So we have, we're pretty traditionally organized. We have, the head and the office of the head and the quality manager, and we have a computerized gene knowledge database, more about that later, meeting facilities, etc. After that. The clinical genetics and genetic counseling unit is really is engaged with actually seeing patients directly and assessing and diagnosing genetic disease on one hand. That's what we call clinical genetics, and then also offering advice if a genetic condition is known to be present in a family. And so this is service really, again, we engage in all aspects of this work, both general counseling prenatal, as well as cancer genetic counseling, which now actually is by far the biggest part of our service. Yeah, I think so. One of my students is tech interested, so I think this is one of these things where you get one line at a time or something like that. Okay, so prenatal screening. We have a joint service with obstetrics, work very closely with them. For instance, in terms of, they see the women, they do the ultrasound and the clinical data gathering. We do the lab work and the genetic counseling if the need arises. So, for example, this is a very traditional format. Newborn screening, work with pediatrics. Basically, we do the comprehensive metabolic screening on our tandem MS. is basically a similar platform as many other countries do, although we would like to expand that. There is now in genetic health services an expansion of newborn screening, and we would like to participate in that. So this is some of the people here to make this more personal. Some of the equipment also. Okay, so yes. Molecular genetics. We have a clinical laboratory, and we have a service for research. We do then analysis and interpretations. We send out referrals, organize that for the hospital, for the country really. So and that involves then making sure the right diagnosis is, right testing is being done, and then finding the appropriate lab to do the testing. This is a considerable part of our work. We also offer advice on molecular testing. In this we work closely with the Department of Biochemistry and Biology, and actually have a joint facility with them. That includes now some high throughput sequencing. In terms of the genomics testing, we can now do clinical exome sequencing in this facility. Cytogenetics. Again, general and specialized services, both constitutional and acquired chromosomal changes. And actually, when we talk about genetics, we really have to be aware of the fact that genetics is now very much becoming somatic genetics as well. That for instance, in terms of leukemias, we do much more diagnostic work on leukemias than, for instance, the hematology does. There's always an ever-increasing demands for translocations, mutation testing, looking for rare mutations, etc. That is becoming a major task for us. And another aspect where you have acquired genetics is in analysis of DNA actually present in the body fluids, for instance, in plasma. This is something that oncology is very much interested in. So that again is a growing field for us, not only the constitutional aspects. And here in this facility we have microarrays. So the combined task of having combined technology, having microarrays and then high throughput sequencing really has transformed our ability to diagnose constitutional disorders. I mentioned some numbers on Thursday, which are basically that we have maybe rare diseases being 6 to 8% of the population, individuals of the population will develop a rare disease in their lifetime, often quite significant morbidity associated with that. Maybe 80% of that is genetic, at least as we understand it today, so we're talking about maybe 5% of the population developing a genetic disease. And when you think about the family, how it's directly affected and also perhaps at risk of themselves having the same disease or their children, then having a rare disease, either it was set in oneself or in the family, is really not rare. It's very important. Maybe you have 10% of the population or more, 10–15% directly affected because somebody in the population has a rare disease. Given how serious this is a significant part of healthcare. It's my impression that this is often underappreciated. And certainly, rare diseases are very often forgotten, even in the differential diagnosis. So, solving or progress in that area is a significant progress in healthcare. It's not all about common disease. Healthcare is not all about common disease. Yes, we also have a biobank. And I'm glad to discuss that. That's a biobank actually for several departments within clinical laboratories, but also a biobank for research. So it's pretty. We have actually a law on that, and actually the recently revised law on that. If anyone is interested in learning more about that. And one aspect, I did say that we have some unique aspects. One of the unique aspects actually is the Icelandic genealogy database, which is actually run by the Genealogical Committee of the University of Iceland and Landspítali. This database actually has a very interesting story, in that, or at least this is the story, at least that's how I understand it. After the nuclear bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, there obviously was great concern about the health effects of being exposed to the nuclear radiation, both the health effects of the individual themselves, but also the genetic effects, the risk to children born to exposed individuals. And this led to then large genetic studies being done on this exposed population, basically looking at the children, how they developed, and whether they had congenital malformations, and what the mutation rate was. And this research went on for maybe 10 years or so, and happily what they discovered is that the genetic effects seemed to be rather small. It was a relief. This is right in the middle of the Cold War with nuclear bombs and rockets being everywhere. And so what basically surfaced was that science really didn't know what the background effect, or the background mutation rate, and the incidence of congenital malformations and development problems, etc., what the background rate was in a non-exposed population. And after some thinking, American scientists decided that Iceland was perhaps the best control population. And so what they, and this was all then driven by the Atomic Energy Commission, and what they did was basically set up a large research project in this country to actually address and study these questions, study the frequency of mutations in humans and human genetics research. They wanted this to be a comprehensive database, but somewhat later in the project it was decided it was only really going to be a demographic database. There were also, back then, there were some issues with privacy and data privacy, and these issues we're all very familiar with today. But this, what survived, they actually published quite a number of papers actually in this 20-year period when this project was ongoing. But what survived this project was this electronic database, genealogy database, which we still have today. Vigdís will tell you more about it and how we use it. But basically that facilitates our work in several areas. This is one of the things that's unique to this country. Although we follow the story on human genealogy databases, and they're growing everywhere. It's a vastly expanding field now to actually generate electronic genealogy databases. So we have had the privilege of being one of the few, if not the only population to have such a database, or databases, I should say. There are several of them now. This is rapidly changing. We do cytogenetics for them. They don't have a cytogenetics lab right now. And we also, some cases we collaborated with them. They've done some whole genome sequences on some cases we have or been involved with. In terms of the risk assessment, maybe I wasn't very specific in terms of prenatal risk assessment. We set up a combined test, both look at translucency and biochemical testing, way back in 2000. We started this actually in 2003. At the time we were actually I believe the 26th laboratory to be certified by the Field Medicine Foundation. We were right there at the front of the curve. But that basically we have it now. We're still running that program. We're having incorporated non-invasive prenatal testing into that. It's in the planning stage.
Okay, I think we will have to go on, but before we leave the floor, there's one question I wanted to think about before the discussions we have, is that is something like that do you see a role for the hospital in translating findings in genetic research into therapeutics and prevention studies in clinical context, which is the theme of this. So how would you see the department or the health system participate in that? So maybe we leave this for a general discussion later on, but to give you something to...
It's a broad question. So
yeah, I know. So you decide how you do it.
Well, the simple answer is yes, absolutely. That's what we do for a living.
Yeah. Okay, but we will go more into details in that. Thank you very much for your talk, and we will now move on. And our next speaker is Albert Smith. He's the Director of Genetics at the Icelandic Heart Association, and I'll leave it to him to introduce the Heart Association or whatever, how he wants to do this. But thank you, and welcome, Albert.
Okay, yeah. So I'm going to say a little bit more that's a little bit more research focused in terms of how and what we're doing with genome-wide association scans and what and how we're applied it, and without actually going into great detail about our particular resources or whatnot. But so let me just start and just sort of give a definition of the genome-wide association study, which is an approach that to rapidly scan markers across complete sets of DNA or genomes of many people to find genetic variations associated with a particular disease. And the particular emphasis is often on common diseases, the diseases that affect large numbers of individuals coming across in various ways. And this approach has actually been quite popular and applied more or less about the past 6 to 8 years, depending on when you say that the GWAS era started. The rationale is basically that at some ancestral point in time, without knowing the genealogy necessarily, that there could be mutations that would make any individual more likely to actually come up with a particular disease and trait, and then it goes down, and that mutation may be propagated over many generations, and that you'll be enriched in certain areas, and you can look out and find those particular mutations or particular polymorphisms, I should more accurately say, that are enriched in individuals that are associated with a particular trait. And if you look at it in terms of just the language of DNA and just read the particular base positions at one point, you might have this just a cartoon example where you have I can't even remember the exact numbers that are on this particular slide. You just genotype at any one particular position. You look and you basically count how many CTs or TTs there are, and basically how many C alleles there are in the cases versus the controls. You see that they're actually enriched 1.35, in terms of the numbers that are put up here in this cartoon example. It's quite a significant enrichment, but it's quite important to note that it's not certainly not cut and dry, and that it's a relatively moderate enrichment, but it can be very significant and very powerful when applied going. So that's I just wanted to say this is the rationale or whatnot. I'm going to say for a brief moment where we come into it, and that's what I say we, I mean the Icelandic Heart Association, and particularly we have a cohort study that we're doing, which is termed the AGES-Reykjavik study, which was initiated in 2002 by the Icelandic Heart Association, which is actually a continuation of the Reykjavik study, which actually recruited all adults that lived in the Reykjavik area starting in 1967, and that were born between 1907 and 1935. But the goal of the AGES-Reykjavik study was to identify genetic risk factors for selected diseases and conditions. And because it's population-based, and this is at the time that this is quite an aged population, the traits and the things that were being tracked was a large number of things, particularly focused on heart disease, but many other things in terms of relative to osteoporosis, relative to cognitive decline, all these things that affect people as they age and affect populations in large numbers or whatnot. And within the cohort, this means that we're tracking close to 6,000 people, and that for us, we genotyped large numbers of individuals to enable GWAS in 2008. In terms of just to say a little bit about the cohort and what we're actually looking at, this is looking at the summary statistics of a few measures of that we have, like I say, close to 6,000 individuals. The average age is 77. And you can look at, in terms of, but they're relatively representative. It's representative of the population of Iceland because people were actually selected randomly, or meant to try to select everyone that lived in Reykjavik, as I said, between 1907 and 1935. We can look at the general traits, and they're fairly representative. But that when you actually come back and apply genetics to any particular one trait, and to begin with, that we had approximately 3,000 individuals that were genotyped in our case with 300,000 markers across the genome. And then you can actually look and then do the test that I just showed you, where you just count the number of alleles associated with any one particular trait and look to see where those are actually enriched. If you actually do that in our sample that we started with, like I say, about 3,000 people, the number of traits where we actually can find what we call genome-wide significance is very, very rare. And genome-wide significance within the community is generally defined to be any time you see a p-value that's less than 5 × 10⁻⁸. That essentially deals with the issue of multiple testing and corrections that you actually need to do. And this is a so-called Manhattan plot, where you just plot the negative log of 10 of the p-value. The red line is this 5 × 10⁻⁸, and the number of times if we were to just look within our cohort, within AGES, which in AGES-Reykjavik, the number of times we actually see something that actually goes above this magic red line is relatively rare. This is a case of just looking at LDL levels. This is an ApoE locus, a well-known locus, long known well before the times of GWAS. So that even the cases where you actually can find something that comes up significant like this just in our cohort, often it's something that would have been known well before the so-called GWAS era actually began. And because of this, and there are a lot of other people worldwide that around the same time had the same realization that in terms of the size of cohorts of people who are actually working at a research level, that you had relatively little power to do things on their own. And so many people, ourselves included, joined various collaborative enterprises, and we join and work with all kinds of people depending on the exact trait, because, as I say, we have ability because we're looking at all kinds of records for all kinds of things, many different diseases, because our cohort's not collecting just because they're diabetic or just because of one particular thing it's population-based. And just to highlight one collaboration that we've been involved with, is actually been particularly productive, is that we came together again about 2008 with a number of other well-known or well-established population-based cohorts, particularly also focused on heart disease, but also having the ability to look at many other things, including the Framingham Heart Study, Rotterdam, ERIC, arthritic risk in communities, cardiac health study, I believe CHS, and others have actually joined in. And then we've actually come through, and once you actually come together, within this framework, there's been over 100,000 samples or people that can actually contribute results for up to 100,000 people. But just sort of saying passing that a lot of times, most cohorts, most people do not have the ability to share individual level data, so the analyses often occur at a particular cohort, and then you contribute the analyses, put them together, and meta-analyze them together to get up to, so that you actually you share summary level results rather than individual level results. But when working this way and actually putting all these samples together or analyses together, it's actually been incredibly productive, not just for ourselves in the charge and other consortiums we participate in, but just as a community worldwide. We ourselves just have participated in countless. Since 2008. We've contributed to publications of over 100 different GWASs and traits, and I can't keep track of everything that actually has come out or whatnot. But that when you actually do, when you work in situations where you actually have a larger number of samples, in contrast the Manhattan plot that I actually showed you previously, which was just based on our own results. This is one that actually came out from a paper that we contributed to last year. It is just based on heart rate. I could choose. I just chose something that's relatively at random. Just had what I thought was a nice figure. And that you just, when you do this, and I don't remember the exact number, but if you want to count the number of loci that actually come up, but this is based on 118,000 samples. And so, when you actually come together and actually have a larger number of samples, that you can see a lot more loci. This is actually, this is continuation of there's been work and publications on heart rate on smaller sample sizes, and as the sample size increases, you find some of the same loci that were found. You should find almost always the one thing I should say about GWAS approach, it's proven to be very robust, and we won't go into the history of common disease and in terms of genetics, but that prior to the GWAS era, things were not necessarily so robust. And so you get a large number of loci, and that's wonderful and great. And then if you actually just look, and this is a catalog that's maintained at the NIH of trying to represent all the loci that pass this magical 5 × 10 to the -8, put into what, at least how they do that, into 17 different categories. I don't even know the exact number. There are literally thousands of loci that have been loci/trait combinations where we've actually found something significant, which is fantastic. Because if you were trying to work in genetics before what I keep referring to as the GWAS era, and for common diseases, it was really hit and miss, where you actually found things really believable or whatnot. And this is just, there's just the number of loci that are being found just continues to explode, and which gives the ability for all kinds of actually different research questions. But then if you actually go back, if you want to come back and say, from these results, how can we actually apply them on a smaller scale? At least I'll just make a couple of comments relative to our cohort, but some of the things apply to individuals per se. Because if you actually go and we participated in a GWAS from the so-called GIANT Consortium, which looks at anthropologic traits, and this was published on height. It was actually just published a couple of weeks ago, and in that publication there are at least from 697 different variants that explain 1/5 of the heritability of height. Height has always sort of been the poster child of what you can actually do with genetics, because it's an incredibly easy thing to measure, and so almost everyone has it, and it has it as a measure. Right? Everyone has a height, and so that when any cohort, whether they're for diabetes or whatever you want to come into, they can usually contribute to this. So this particular GWAS is based on approximately 250,000 people. Well, this isn't a GWAS, this is a way we apply it. But the GWAS actually defines 697 variants, which explain 1/5 of the genetic variability of height. I'm missing the word genetic in there. So the thing that I did just a couple of days ago was to actually pull out these 697 variants and actually make a genetic risk score. Just waiting for all the loci that are actually in this paper, and then go back and look at our 3,000 individuals and actually say, how can I use that? How can I actually apply that to actually predict for their height? And so I have the men and the women here. You can go through. This is actually extremely predictive on a population basis, and it looks quite nice, and it's extremely significant and comes up here. But that if you actually were to go and just be careful and to emphasize, if you talk about the people with the highest score, which is making the highest prediction of what their height should actually be, that okay, fine, there's someone up here that's nearly 2 meters tall, or 195 or 197, whatever exactly it is, centimeters, but that has a high score. But there's several other individuals that are even taller, but that are in the middle of a distribution for the risk curve. So so you actually have a very significant and very strong risk score, but when you actually come back and actually talk about any one particular person, you don't have the specificity that you actually would really like to be able to make an exact prediction of, if you were to do a screening at birth and actually say something about how tall you actually expect them to be. You could do this test like, well, I think there's a likelihood that they're going to be taller and whatnot, but to say their exact height, oh, they're going to be 197, we don't have that ability, far from it. And this is for a poster child of traits. I think there was another quick story I was going to tell you, but actually I'm going to just cut it out because I think, because the one thing that I want to sort of emphasize or just sort of say, I'll just keep going. I have to I just wanted to, because I want to make the point, I was going to make it with a data example, but I'm just going to say it verbally, is that when you actually talk about this, that even though I can't do a measure on height, and a genetic measure on height and say exactly what one's height's going to be, I don't want to be, in terms of as a researcher, I don't want to be pessimistic. And because there are ways that we can actually apply the data and learn things that are scientific and medically relevant, but that don't actually apply genetically directly to the marker to go back and use it or apply it in the clinic. Because you can't, it's not always, oh, I'm going to take a piece of DNA and do that measure. That's not the only thing that we can actually use genetics to actually learn things from. And I was going to show you a quick example of how we can actually use markers associated with heart disease and how we can infer whether genes are directly involved versus not directly involved in the particular process of the development of heart disease, which is an important research question, or important thing to know about how genes act. But in terms of actually going out and applying them, they have little direct utility that way. In terms of direct being going, giving a piece, some DNA to Jan and him doing a measure. But it's, in terms of understanding the whole process, there's a lot of things going on. And I, don't want, because I don't want anyone, to take this as a negative, pessimistic statement. I still see this as an incredibly optimistic graph, even though I can't necessarily, and undoubtedly 23andMe and the companies that actually do this will make similar predictions like this. But this is what the predictions actually look like in reality when you look at it over across the population.
Thank you, Albert.
I think actually your last story was probably very important for the context of this.
Well, if it comes up and there's a want for word, I have like 5.
I want to allow at least one question here. I think we will just have to. The coffee will have to be short.
So you can explain approximately 20%. What about if you use sequencing? Would you be able to explain more? That's one question. The other one is the RPR. Can you earn money on this? Are there patents on some of the genes for drug targets? Okay. And then the third one, you said your material can be used for the different diseases. And so the informed content is that so broad that you can use the material for everything?
I'm going to ask the second question again, but on the first point, in terms of sequencing, I think understanding and doing sequencing to directly apply it, particularly to common traits, if we just say height, for example, height's probably not the best example for that. It's just in its infancy. And there are a lot of people that hold out a lot of hope, have held out hope. You actually do sequencing and understand a lot more. But that's not, without going into a lot of detail, that's not immediately dropped out like instant smoking gun, strong things for common disease. Jan can and would be much more hopeful. He can say a lot more about rare traits and severe cognitive impairment, birth defects and whatnot. There are a lot of things that actually that could be done. But in terms of making predictability about height or anything, that would add relatively little. Informed consent. We actually. Yeah, but he asked if our informed consent, how it actually works to allow us to work a lot of different traits. Because we have this population-based cohort where we actually recruited people that came in for a 2-day protocol or whatnot, we actually have a broad consent. They're broadly consented to participate in anything from that. For about 2/3 of our people, we actually saw them twice. The first time, there was an optional connection to hospital records as well, that people could opt out of having their hospital records connected or not. Most people actually said yes, and we didn't even use their hospital records. For the people that came a second time, the consent is actually done in a way, if they came in, it also involved connecting it actually to the hospital records. But that said, hospital records, for a lot of the things we look at, we don't actually, because there's a centralized hospital, relatively mostly centralized records, it's quite powerful, but we don't actually always need that. And we often can work, because we have this 2-day protocol, we have a lot of information just from that, and then we don't actually need that. I have to repeat the second question.
About the RPR and patents, and whether for heart diseases you can develop new drugs.
So, in terms of this, particularly in terms of the CHARGE consortium that I mentioned, and a lot of other people, we do not actively pursue patents on these markers directly, and we want them in the public domain and available to anyone. We're basically academics, and we're just trying to get the information out there, and we're not actively pursuing it. And that when commercial enterprises, because there are companies that do these type of things, and we do collaborate with them at times, but when they come in and join, they're not allowed to use the results and take them to patent or to plug them into their drug pipeline at any priority whatsoever.
Okay. If there are more hands, I saw it had to be a very short question and short answer. John?
Well, on the theme that Tim mentioned on Thursday, that weight actually was a better predictor than any SNP pattern. I was wondering about your height prediction, how that compares to the parental heights.
Yeah,
I use parental heights to predict.
I did just a relative score just on individuals at random. We, for some of the individuals in Iceland, being Iceland, because people are connected, we have information on parents at times. That's actually more predictive. The parental height is even more predictive than what I actually just showed you right now. And so, all you do is you take the parental height, average that, make a correction whether they're male or female, and that's going to actually be more predictive than anything I actually just showed you. Yes.
So it's a great pleasure to welcome Vigdís Stefánsdóttir. She's a genetic counselor in Iceland. She's been working in the department and giving advice on genetic disorders since 2006, so she has a vast experience in the field. With that, Vigdís, I think people have all come back. We haven't lost anyone, or at least very few people. So please, Vigdís.
Hello, thank you for the talk here. As Reynir said, my name is Vigdís. I'm a genetic counselor, the only genetic counselor in Iceland. So there's plenty to do. And my background is that I did my master's in Cardiff in 2004-2006, and many of you know Angus Black, and you mentioned one of my hobbies. I offered Angus once to look him up in public databases or databases on the internet, and he said, well, you wouldn't find this, nothing about me, this, you're very private. And he's a very private person. Well, when I got back, I knew almost everything about his family and his ancestors, quite a lot. But he didn't know himself, so yeah. If you look at people on the internet, you find quite a lot of things. Heather Curtin was my MSc supervisor, yeah, and she's still my supervisor because I'm doing a PhD. And with her, I'm also doing a sort of educational program for family healthcare professionals, which is going to be on the internet for everyone to look up. I'm used to talk to probably just one person. Sorry. Well, family history is nothing new. Many of you know the Book of Genesis in the Bible, which is very early on record of family history. In Iceland, we had record of family histories were basically from the settlement, as you can see. And in this country, we had the first nationwide census in 1703. We still have those information. And in this country also, genealogy is very common and it's very popular pastime. So when you go to the library, you see long, long rows of genealogy books and families or places. Book of Settlement was started very early on in the 1100s, and I got an earlier copy from 1948. We reprint this every now and then. And it was a very practical thing. In a country where you, every now and then, part of the population died from all kinds of diseases, or we had eruptions of volcanoes killing, I don't know how many. So people had to prove who they were and what claims they could have on lands and properties, and also that making sure that they weren't marrying their first cousins or something like that. So this is a very important part of Icelandic history. Nowadays, many people have computers, even though there's lots of books. And we have large databases on the internet. They're partly available for everyone, depending on what kind of database it is. The first one, the genealogy database of the Genetics Committee, which is a very odd name, but that's the name of it. And Jóhannes did just before. That's the one we used in clinic. We are able to use it in genetic counseling. Decode Book of Icelanders, that's partially available to everyone with Kennetal with Icelandic ID. I think all the Nordic countries have Kennetal IDs like that. You have to have an Icelandic if you want to be able to go into that one. Obviously, scientists have better availability or accessibility than we do. Icelandic Roots is a very curious database. It's about 500,000 people. It's now commonly accessible. It costs about, I think, $100 a year or something like that. And they also have genealogy of all those that moved to the USA and Canada many years ago. So we have a means of finding information. So this is sort of an example of how we can trace two people in those two databases, Book of Icelanders and Icelandic Roots. That's you. Yeah. I found out that I couldn't trace myself or connect myself to anyone, really. So I had to use you. So this is a very easy way to do that. But pedigrees are quite important in clinical genetics. They're the perfect tools. You see the family history on just one page, or depending on the size of it. And it can be used to look at the disorders in the family, for genetic researches, and for us, obviously, to make a risk assessment. For the genetic counselor to make a family pedigree, sitting with the counselor, is a very good way of getting to know the client, finding out about the family dynamics and the thoughts and worries and things like that. But that's a very sort of slow way of gathering information, so we now use electronic means mostly, although I'll always sit down and do a small picture at least. In consulting counseling, as in other counseling, the accuracy of information is essential. We have to have very accurate information about, is the primary disease, the metastasis, when was the counseling diagnosed or the person that we came about. And all clinics all around the world, they make great effort to collect this family information about cancer, but if you only have the information when in counseling, you don't get enough. Usually people don't know enough about their relatives. So talking about cancer genetic counseling, this is the history of cancer genetic counseling in Iceland. We started the cancer part of the counseling in December 2006. And we had 2 counselors, and now we have 1,400 new firms up to date. And that's quite a lot for a very small department. So how do we do this? Everyone can refer to or either by self or by health professional to the counseling. If he or she does not know about the BRCA history in the family, which is quite often the case even in Iceland, we have him or her sign a consent so we can get the information from the database. Before I do that, I check in our database, which is quite big, it's about 160,000 people, if he or she belongs to a known BRCA family or a family which we have any known mutation. If not, the consent is sent to the office. The cancer registry then asks all the cancers, it's diagnosed all the relevant information we need. And me and an oncologist who is Jónsson, I don't know some of you might know him, we sit down and go over the pedigree and make a risk assessment depending on the family history. We also use computer program to make risk assessment. It's called here, some of you may know that, but we more or less look at it ourselves. If the person is high risk, we offer genetic testing. If not, we send them over home and depending on the pedigree, give advice. If the counselor knows about BRCA in the family or is included in one of the family trees, we offer testing, and that goes for everyone. So this is a very small part of a pedigree, which we get from the database. We get usually information from grandparents or their parents and all the people below them. So a typical pedigree contains anywhere from 150 to 100 people, and it's very common to have like 500 people. The largest one is 4,200. We can't print it out, it's too big. Our experience of these electronic pedigrees is quite good. I'm doing a survey of the counselees that have come to us and ask them questions about how they feel about this. And mostly they say it's quite good, and some say, well, I'm quite surprised you didn't have this information. I thought you had all information about all families in Iceland in the hospital. And we tell them that if there's something in the pedigree they don't know, or there's information about others like this disorder or cancer or something they don't know about, we can't show it to them. So they rarely see the big pedigrees. They generally trust our information, they trust the information is right, and I can't remember an incident where it's not right. But every now and then we find relatives that people don't know about, which gives us another why we can't show it to them. So in Iceland, BRCA, that's a special interest of me, that's my PhD. We have had 1,400 individuals, we tested 1,000, don't test everyone, and out of those there's 250 positive, and they belong to 53 BRCA families. Those families are quite different in cancers. We've noticed that in some families people get cancers very late or very early. There are few or many cancers in the families. They're quite different. We have 3 BRCA1 families with the fountain mutation, and we have found three new mutations in the BRCA1 gene, which clearly are in Icelandic families. So we are testing for them as well now. But all these BRCA1 family mutations seem to be low penetrance if we look at the family trees, which is a bit of a surprise. Those testing positive BRCA, they have surveillance, every 6 months, and it works quite nicely. So they come to the hospital for MRI, and then they go for the latest, I can't remember the name for it, but it's cancer surgery. Those are the increased pancreatic cancer. They have also surveillance if they want, and we are sort of on the way to set up surveillance for colon cancer families. But to make a decision about having genetic testing is not easy. It's quite difficult. Some people feel that they have to do it because of the family or children or something. This is all actual sentences I've had from my counsellors. Others don't want to know. People are increasingly worried about the insurance, about work, about discrimination. So we have to also take that into account when we talk to people. It's not an easy decision. It's not like we just come and have a testimony and go out. There's always two sides to it. It's both good and bad, pros and cons. And all this is something we have to address when we talk to people. So then we come to the question of this meeting, right to know. It's a fundamental question. It's many issues. And there's, as we said yesterday, what is there to know? Is there anything to know? When to know? Who should know? For me as a genetic counselor, it's a very good question because my job is actually to give information to people. But I give relevant information to counselors when they know and how they want to know it. It's my belief that people need to control what they want to know and how they want to know it. So you can't press people, give them information you don't want to have. And at my desk at the moment, I've got quite a few folders from people that have had the offer of genetic testing. They can go anytime they want. They haven't. And I also got folders for people that have gone to testing, but they haven't come back for the answer. So I know it's difficult. Although the majority want to know the answer, not all of them want to. And with that, we're all quite different. We're all similar. We're all equal.
Yes, question?
Very interesting about the low penetrance BRCA.
Yeah.
So the BRCA gene is on a list from the American College about the incidental findings. Is that a mistake?
BRCA1 has a tendency to mutate, but not a mutation in it. So it has been surprised that we haven't found more mutations sooner.
Well, how low is the penetrance, and does it depend on different mutations?
I can't tell you how low because we haven't calculated. It's quite recent findings. But just by the look at the pedigree of like 600 people, calculating, counting how many people have cancers, we can just see that it's low.
Yes, thank you. My name is Arngrímsson from Estonia, and I was wondering whether people who would do direct-to-consumer tests through internet, would they come to you? Do you see any population that's going to come to you for counseling on this, or would they go to the general practitioners, or they don't go anywhere?
Well, the short answer is I don't know because I haven't had any.
Oh, right.
I have no idea. I know Jóhannes has had one or two inquiries, but that's we probably would try to solve it if someone came and asked me.
Do you want to comment on this? Have you had any request from someone who has done? Could you repeat that?
Direct-to-consumer testing?
No, we, I think I mentioned that also yesterday. We really don't get any requests for genetic counseling regarding such results. Occasionally it's what we call a hallway consultation. People can stop me on that. I'm walking around the hospital if you show me results, but never really a formal consultation. That would be very rare.
Vilhjálmur?
Vigdís, there was a great increase in your counselees this year, or what?
Well, it's to date.
To date, yeah.
Yeah. So it's, I just calculated yesterday to check how many new referrals we've had up to date. So this is the accumulated number.
Yeah, okay. Was there any sort of Angelina Jolie effect?
Oh yes, it was. Oh yes, quite a lot. We still feel the effect.
You still feel it?
Yeah.
So just a follow-up, so out of the 1,400, I calculate roughly 600 or so up to 2012, so the majority of the 1,400 have come in the last couple of years?
Yes.
Okay,
And
thank you.
the steep increase quite a lot last year.
So following up on Thomas' question, when I talked to a clinical geneticist in Denmark, she said that they estimated the frequency of BRCA to be about 1 to 2% maybe, and that the data on the penetrance is based on sick families, families with hereditary BRCA. So given that, and given that you don't know the penetrance in healthy families, if you found BRCA in a member from a healthy family, would you feedback the results?
I will give that person the information he or she needs to go back to his family or family, get information letter to distribute. I can't go directly to the family. There's no way.
Okay, I think we're coming to a bit. I will also leave some question, maybe for the group to discuss, and your contribution with this. It's about the legislations about combining pedigrees, as you saw here, from genealogical databases and health information. We have the example from cancer. And the duty to inform. If you have 4,200 individuals and you have cross-referred to the cancer registry, what is the duty to inform the other relatives? You cannot expect a counsel legal comes in to know all the relatives. Probably a lot of them are deceased because they have gone back. So that's different. So maybe this is something we need to discuss, the legislation around this, and address the question of duty to inform under these circumstances. What is the legislation here, if someone has the knowledge there, and how we have in practice done this. I know we have some working rules in the department, which I think is a very, well, it's for the discussion. I throw this out to the audience.
And what a terrific morning. Quick background to my talk. A lot of the slides that you're going to see have artwork. My brother's an art professor at the University of Alberta, and we actually collaborate at times. And some of this work, which is huge, by the way, it's really spectacular if you see it, it was inspired by working with scientists, working with stem cell researchers, working with geneticists. And so I think it's some terrific stuff. I have no idea what that is, but it's very cool. So anyway, I was asked to give a quick talk just to really stimulate discussion. So I decided to say a few words about what the evidence says about a lot of things. And really, it's a plea for a rational evidence-based approach to policy in this area. This piece, by the way, by my brother is huge, and this is just a little corner of it. It's really spectacular. Some of this stuff comes from a piece that I published not too long ago on the integration of whole genome sequencing into the healthcare systems. But I think the comments that we came up with in this piece, which is a really was a tremendous interdisciplinary process. I wish that we invited some people from this room to participate in this workshop next time, because it really was a very rich discussion. But really, what came out of that event and this paper was really this idea: let's slow down and let's really see what the evidence says about benefits and harms. And we tried to map not only what the benefits and harms are, but also all the forces that are kind of driving this into the clinic, perhaps prematurely. So what I want to do today is talk about the hope, the harm, and what some of the confusion highlight that there in fact is a lot of lack of consensus out there on a lot of key issues. This is a really wonderful piece that just was published by the UNC group, North Carolina group, Eric Young's group, on what the issues are, the ethical issues are associated with the integration of genomic technologies in the healthcare system. One thing I find fascinating about this is they surveyed the proponents, the advocates of it. So these are the people that, rah, we've got to get this into the clinic. And still, they found, don't worry, you don't need to read it, but informed consent is still a big issue. Privacy and confidentiality of the view is a big issue. No surprises here, right? Access to these technologies and the cost of these technologies. These are the kinds of usual things that we see. So I do think we need to be careful about the benefits. Now, this was my talk on Thursday, so I won't go through this. But they're really, I think that we need to be very cautious about how people frame the benefits in this area. And one thing that came up on Thursday night, and again a little bit yesterday, was the idea of, again, another piece about, an interesting piece about the dangers of moving to the clinic too quickly. But is pharmacogenetics? You keep hearing that again and again. Yes, there may not be that many benefits associated with lifestyle changes in the context of personalized medicine, but we are going to have all these new drugs. Again, I know everyone in the room knows this, but even here we have to be careful about over-promising, and the best example, of course, is the warfarin story. Everyone here knows the warfarin story, right? The idea that it was pitched as the poster child. I did this great study where I mapped how many geneticists called this the poster child of personalized medicine. What a mistake, right? On and on. It has become the poster child of the future of pharmacogenetics, the poster child of pharmacogenetics, the poster child of pharmacogenetics, the poster child of pharmacogenetics. That was a mistake, right, you guys, because it's really turned out the use of warfarin, genetic testing for the use of warfarin has actually turned out to be much more complicated. And that's a generous interpretation, but that is much more complicated than initially promised. So good, once again, a very good cautionary tale about over-promising in this realm. Okay, so what I really want to talk about are the harms. So we have hype about the benefits that's maybe having an impact on the policy of genomics into the healthcare system. But there also is a lot of hype on harms, I think. And that's sort of our world, right? Our world. So we're guilty of this too. So this is, I draw some of this from a piece I wrote with some of the individuals from the Duke team, Robert Cook-Deegan, and also Jan Jolie from McGill. And it's true, I think what we try to map is, look, yes, there's hype about benefits, but there's also a lot of hype about harm. For example, the idea that people will freak out when they get this information. And there's really no strong evidence that's the case. Where's our... people are pretty resilient. I'm not saying people don't need counseling, but this idea that people are going to freak out has not really panned out if you believe the existing data. This one, for sure, it was a study that got a lot of attention, and I think it can be rightly critiqued. But nevertheless, there isn't this overwhelming empirical evidence that people freak out when they receive genetic risk information. There are a whole bunch of issues, costs to the healthcare system, whether it's testing kids, physician knowledge, regulation of this industry, is it going to lead to unnecessary follow-up and unnecessary iatrogenic injuries? All of these things, I think, can be empirically tested. And if you just look at the idea that it's going to lead to unnecessary testing, I think is fascinating. This is one of the areas that I'm very interested in. Is the introduction of personalized medicine, is the introduction of a more genomic approach to healthcare going to lead to more unnecessary tests and increase the cost? And it's a fascinating time to be talking about this, because at least in North America, there's a huge push to do less testing, not more, less screening, less testing. No, let's stop this PSA stuff. There's even questions about what kind of mammogram testing we should be doing. And in fact, there's this in Canada and the United States, this Choose Wisely program. Does this exist in any of your countries? This is a new program to actually try to get doctors to do less. They have a very short list of screening and tests that they believe are justified. So, but then on the other hand, you have this happening, right? The idea that genomic testing is going to push up testing. So we have these two forces that are rubbing against each other. I'm just starting to think about this and about perhaps even doing a study on point. This was a great piece. Oh, this is my piece. It's not necessarily a great piece. This is a adequate paper where we argue that medical legal forces, liability issues, the duties that physicians owe to their patients may make this even more complicated. You know, the hope of personalized medicine is it's going to narrow the cohort of individuals that get a particular treatment. Here we argue that that may not necessarily play out as hoped because of physicians' obligations to their patients, particularly in North America, which are very, very strong, and physicians can be in a position to advocate for their patient any kind of medical treatment, even if the benefits might be somewhat marginal. Again, pushing up the cost of the system. This is the very interesting piece I wanted to refer to. It was in Forbes, and the reason I think it's interesting is this Forbes is it's a popular magazine, and arguing that genomic testing is not going to reduce the cost of the healthcare system. It's in fact going to drive up the cost because genomic sequencing is the beginning of a diagnostic cascade, right? Which I think is a very interesting way to phrase it. And fits with the argument I was making before about genomic testing kind of pushing against this overall theme of trying to do less screening and less testing. But here again, I think we need to be cautious and look at what the empirical evidence says. And while there isn't a lot of studies out there on this, and they're increasing, I was actually looking at the back here to try to find more. Some of the data says that even this concern might be overstated. Now this is just one study, and they found that multiplex testing did not necessarily lead to this cascade. I'm skeptical of this study, but I have my own biases. But I still think, even here, we've got to turn to what the empirical evidence actually tells us. And the other harm is that's often raised, and was raised yesterday, is the sphere of discrimination. Very hot topic in Canada right now, this idea that we need anti-discrimination laws, anti-genetic discrimination laws. I don't know what the situation is in Iceland. Is there an anti-discrimination law? So, in fact, and this is a push that's been happening in Canada, it's intensifying. It's getting a lot of attention in the popular press. Just a few days ago, the opposition, the NDP, called for federal legislation to ban genetic discrimination. But once again, if we look at the evidence in this area, it's very, very equivocal. It's very equivocal, right? This was Hank Rayleigh, many people know, he wrote this great piece in the New England Journal of Medicine. There's virtually no case of genetic discrimination ever been noted. This was the piece from the New York Times. And Hank really questions whether there is any. This is a study that just came out. It was done by Jan Jolie, again from McGill, where he found very little evidence to support the idea that we need to have anti-genetic discrimination laws. But still, it marches on. I love to compare the idea of genetic discrimination to, I think it's still the #1 killer in the world, hypertension. Yeah, it's one of the #1 killers in the world, one of the biggest killers in the world. And we are told to find out what our blood pressure is. Does everyone here know what their blood pressure is? We're told to get it. We're even encouraged to do it at home, direct to consumer, find out what your blood pressure is, right? And you can buy it, in Canada, you can go into drugstores. Can you do this here? And just stick your arm in the machine and get your blood pressure. You can. That information, and building on what we heard already today, is vastly more powerful than probably 95% of the genetic information you get, right? And it could impact your life insurance. In Canada, of course the life insurance can say, what's your blood pressure? They'll take it. They'll come to your house and they'll take it. It can impact your employment. You can get fired if you have too high blood pressure. Do we have anti-high blood pressure discrimination laws? Fitting these two things in a conceptually consistent manner I find fascinating and difficult. And there's no push for an anti-high blood pressure discrimination law. And also, I don't think that a court would ever say an insurance company could not use that information because it's clearly material. You get where I'm going with this. The last point I want to make, that's all right, is to highlight again the lack of consensus on many key issues we were talking about this at the break this morning. My favorite example is the idea of consent and ownership of samples, and I thought this would be a wonderful example because it came up yesterday. We did a study, I'm very proud of this study actually, where we used the exact same instrument and interviewed scientists, these are ethicists, law professors, privacy advocates, patients, and the general public. We asked them all the same question. Who do you think owns the samples? Now this was a much more sophisticated question, but for our purposes, that's basically what we asked. And look, absolutely no consensus. Most scientists report that the research institution owns the sample. Most ethicists, law, and privacy groups say the research participant owns the sample. Can you imagine if that had played out? And I love how the privacy advocates, right? So these are government privacy commissioners. Like these are the people that are going to decide if it gets litigated. 60% say the research participant owns the sample. And then look at the public; they're all over the place. All over the map. So the public divided. That's the paper, by the way, if you're interested. So there's no consensus. We also did this with informed consent, with the broad consent topic. Once again, look at the diversity. Of course, no scientists preferred reconsenting. No surprise. But look, most ethicists, lawyers, and privacy advocates prefer tiered consent, which scientists hate, which is almost like the worst approach, right? Because administratively, it's a nightmare. And once again, the public is divided. So again, no consensus.
Can you explain tiered consent?
Tiered consent?
Yeah.
So that's the idea that you have like a menu at the beginning. Yeah, and I remember that people in this room have been debating this for 2 decades too. When that was first, people thought that might be an answer, but it's administratively a nightmare, right? I mean, it's almost worse than reconsenting, because you don't know, every time you look at a sample, you got to go back to the consent form and find out. When you're talking about tens of thousands of people in the work. So really no consensus. And again, just to highlight the degree that there's no consensus, I love this study. It just came out recently. I don't know if you guys saw this one. I don't know if you've seen this one. Where this was the biobank that's being put forward in Michigan. Everyone's in favor of it, right? They, oh, this is a great idea, we love to do it. But look, at 78% of the students said they would want to reconsent every time their sample is used. Now, so you gotta be suspicious of these studies, because if you ask someone if they want to reconsent, they're gonna say yes. It doesn't necessarily mean in real life it's gonna play out that way. But the important thing is that there is that kind of lack of consensus that I want to highlight. This is my ship of consensus on a sea of disconsent. My brother didn't paint that, that's Turner. You know, we have the biobanking community in the middle where we think there's all this consensus on these important issues. And sometimes legislation is created. But, you know, all these issues are going to be contested, right, in the general public, in the broader community where there really isn't any consensus. So I'll skip over that. That's Hank's great point, and I'll skip over our recent study. And just highlight that there's also no consensus, really, if you look at the policy documents in this area. Huge diversity of opinions and all these things. So I'll end with, again, my plea for rational, evidence-based policy, and for more discussions like this one. Great. Thanks very much.
I'll make this very brief. Thanks for fantastic meetings these days. What might seem simple in the beginning, how to translate findings in genetics into healthcare improvements, seems to be relatively complicated. As more you deep into the matter, I mean, more and more questions and perhaps uncertainty reveals. So also today, some of the talks have been just excellent. So we can see the sort of conflict or differences between, the individual-based approaches and population-based approach. I think the genetic standard here in Iceland is just fantastic. You have all possibilities to take advantage of the new technology and translate that into clinical practice. On the other hand, there are also some questions when thousands of participants have their genome analyzed, and when you investigate height, it might not be that complicated, of course, but if you use the same material to go into Alzheimer's disease and look at rare variants, of course there are some questions, and you can there ask a question about not right to not know, but the right to know, because some people would like to know, okay, what do you find? Do you find some rare variants that predispose to Alzheimer's disease or another disease that you might have the possibility to do something with? What you said, Tim, was extremely, of course, interesting and relevant about evidence, but sometimes it's not easy to find evidence when you have a completely new situation. When you have a completely new technology evolving, you have to perhaps step carefully forwards instead, because if you don't, do anything, you will not, advance and take and use the technology in the right way. One of the scope of the meeting was the discrepancy between the population-based approach and individual-based approach. Perhaps the technology is now sort of merging, and perhaps the technology is evolving so that when you start out by analyzing thousands of people, you sometimes end up with some rare variants, but you have to take into account what to do. And is it necessary to report back to the individual persons? So again, thanks for organizing these fantastic meetings, and I look forward to the discussion.
When we were planning the meeting yesterday, the Nordic Bioethics Committee, we want to have it very focused and narrow. But from the first talk, we knew that this is a very complex issues, and we have been seeing that this morning. Again, there are many issues that we need to raise, and there are so many angles, and there are so many complexities. I just want to, because I'm going to also be very brief, because I think we are all dying to have a general discussion. But the one thing that struck me yesterday, for instance, and went through many of the talks, was the way we talk about the science, the communication, the language we use, the hype that is there, and I think that, we talk about the right to know, but we basically are talking about informing people about the very messy data, and it's often very difficult to interpret and really understand. And but we want to have things neatly packed, and we want to have knowledge that is sort of neat and understandable. And these are, of course, we're taking us in two different directions. The hype is also very important, and all these issues have been very much debated in Iceland as well. I mean, there has been a lot of hypes, and there was a lot of hype here in relation to the database, the DCODE database, 15 years ago almost. But of course, this is the reality we are in, and we are hyping it, as Tim was drawing attention to. We are hyping the benefits, and we are hyping the harms as well. And maybe we are always polarizing the debate far too much, and I think we suffer. I mean, at the end of the day, that's we're all suffering really from it, because we can't really get the right information, and people think they are getting, they should get much more knowledge about things that is not there. And I must say, I mean, one thing that, if I take it sort of into an Icelandic context, we have had, of course, heated debates often in the society about genetics, but we don't have all these studies, and I envy Tim to be able to refer to all the studies about how the debate has been, how polarized it has been, what kind of a debate there has been in the public media, in social media, and so on. And I think that's really something that we need to do more about. There have, of course, been studies, but more needs to be done, and it would be nice if we could monitor more how people really think about these issues and how well these evidence or information from the science really, how well it reaches the public and in what way it does. So these are just a few points to take on to the discussions, and I think we already, you know, we don't have much time, but we have a lot of questions, I think. Thank you very much.
Tim?
I think the point that was raised about the level of evidence is fascinating and also a very tough question. You're right. What do you do when you don't have enough evidence? And from a social policy perspective, it can be a tremendous challenge. So, and people may be aware, in some jurisdictions, like in Japan, they're actually trying to reduce the level of evidence needed to move to the clinic for this very reason, saying we're never going to have enough evidence, so let's lower the standard in order to get to the clinic so we can get the evidence. I'm worried about that because I'm worried that once you move into the clinic, it's very hard to get you out. You know, once something's been implemented in the healthcare system, it often stays. In addition to that, I worry that we will produce bad evidence. You know, if it's done only like a phase 4 kind of post-implementation kind of analysis. But having said that, I completely agree that it's a real challenge deciding how much evidence is really needed on both sides of the equation to deal with the harms and the benefits. I don't think anyone's really decided.
Two questions. One was the Angelina Jolie effect. Is that seen as a good thing? And is that kind of effect of there being a high-profile figure something that can be made any constructive use of, or is that just a kind of a one-off phenomenon? And the second one was your point about discrimination, saying hardly any evidence. It occurs to me, if it happened, why would you expect to see any evidence? I mean, the absence of evidence isn't the same thing as evidence of absence. So I just wonder there, is it something which, in fact, you can make that claim? I mean, maybe in a narrow thing on particular insurance companies, yeah. But in general, in a wider issue of discrimination, would you expect to see it? How would you expect to see it?
How would you actually see it and measure it?
Yeah.
So, I mean, as you probably know, there's a vast literature on this. So, I think you can safely say that there isn't evidence that it's this massive crisis that was often indicating. That there would be a signal of that. We'd be able to see it. Secondly, they have looked at this, they being the academic community, a variety of ways, both sort of interviews and more surveys, and also trying to do more of a sort of qualitative analysis. So they've come at it from different angles, and it doesn't appear that it's a broad phenomenon. Having said all that, there's this idea that there could be discrimination going on, what they call irrational discrimination, where, yes, genetic information isn't powerful, but people are still making sort of these irrational discriminatory choices on genetic information. My response to that is, well, if that's the case, we don't need an anti-discrimination law. We need more education about what genetics really means and its impact on the community. With the Jolie question, so we have studied this. This has been a part of our sort of research portfolio. It's not a one-off. Celebrities have a tremendous impact, absolutely tremendous impact, more than we probably like to admit. There's lots of examples, specific examples, but they have an impact on suicide rates, on smoking, on the screening, cancer screening of for various diseases. So they have a real tremendous impact. Whether it's constructive or not is open for debate. I think the Jolie thing is sort of a little bit of both, or a lot of both, actually. It has increased screening rates dramatically, and it's held. The Jolie effect has not diminished that much. It's held. So, and in Canada they call it the Jolie gene now. So, real.
But is there something constructive that can be used of what lies behind that?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point, and I said this a little bit on Thursday night. Look, celebrities aren't going away in popular culture. I'm fascinated by the fact that a real quick anecdote. So we had dinner on Thursday night. It's like an Icelandic cliche. Who sat right next to us?
In the Nordic house.
Bjork, right? She could not do that in the United States or in the UK, and probably not in Canada, because she would have been swamped, right? So I think the Icelandic view of celebrity culture is probably different from North America and the UK. She couldn't walk down the street, I don't think, in New York without getting swamped, where it's here. So yeah, celebrity culture, huge. I think we need, bottom line, we need to figure out how we can harness it for good, right? Because it's not going away. I think we need to get clever to see how we can use it in construction.
But nobody's actually worked on that question.
What's that?
Nobody's actually worked.
We are trying to do a little bit of that right now.
I think you could put it in the context of genetic research. I think Iceland is very relaxed to all the issues we've been raising here. We see that by the participation in the studies. There was a call from the Decode a couple of months ago where they asked people to participate, and they said we want 100,000. We don't know actually what the number was, but they had they didn't maybe get 100,000, but they get quite a lot of people just came and flocked to, and they sent the samples. And before that, under the organized studies, they had over 100,000 samples, and Art Association, there's a good participation. So Iceland seems to be very relaxed about genetic discriminations, the dangers of participating in studies, and that's maybe a little bit in the culture that we have here.
I think I would like to comment on I think we also, I think it's a very valuable resource here in Iceland, this willingness of people to participate in research. But it's a valuable resource that we must not exploit. And I think it's dangerous to treat it without much care and in accordance with all sort of main guidelines of research ethics. And this particular call that Reynir was mentioning was done, I found it very questionable, in cooperation with the National Rescue Team, which walked from house to house. And the National Rescue Team is a voluntary association in Iceland, extremely popular. And the rescue team got compensation for each sample collected. Now, I mean, this I think is something for us to think about, whether this is the right way to proceed. Also, I mean, there are other questions there about giving broad consent for the use of the samples for future research, which can be of various kinds, but was not mentioned specifically in the consent form.
You couldn't do that in Canada.
No, I know.
That would be a research ethics committee wouldn't allow.
I would think so, but Thomas, first, now.
There was also a little about the evidence. In Denmark, we do have a problem with insurance. There are cases, also some of them have been in the newspapers, that people have not been allowed to have insurance because they went to genetic counselors. And all the genetic counselors know that this is a problem, and they give advice, hey, perhaps you should consider the insurance issue before we proceed. So it is a problem. But of course I agree, for instance, if you consider to use the new genetic technology for screening purposes on a population basis, of course we need to be extremely careful and find out what is the value. And there the evidence is absolutely important.
Also, yes. Speak up, please. We are trying to record. Ask everyone to speak loudly here.
Thank you. I'm a social scientist. I'm an anthropologist, and I've been watching developments from the sidelines for the last 10 years or so, although I've been basically involved earlier. And it seems to me I have a bit of a reflection and a suggestion. it seems to me there is a cooling process going on, and I think Salvör was indicating that this has been a decade of dialogue, and although we still have hypes on different kinds, the heat that we had 10 years ago, at least in this country, is gone, and people have been fleshing out the issues, the ethical issues and social, and etc. So there seems to be a new open space for a genuine dialogue with the scientists, geneticists, and humanities scholars, and policymakers. And I think this meeting is a good indication of that. My suggestion relates to how to move from here. I think one important avenue is to explore the possibilities of governance. I mean, people have mentioned the need for, Reynir mentioned the need for legislation. There have been indications of sort of debates on ownership of samples, etc. But it seems to me we need to go further in that direction. Of course, we can go in many ways, but there has been recent work, exciting work on the concept of solidarity, and the Nuffield Council published in 2011 a major report by a colleague of mine at King's College London, Barbara Freinsack and Alena Boyks, if you pronounce it that way. And they've also published a paper last year in Medical Law Review entitled A Solidarity-Based Approach to the Governance of Research Biobanks. And I think the debate that Vilhjálmur mentioned in the Icelandic, the recent debate in the Icelandic context nicely illustrates the need for a new kind of forum for dialogue. And it's important to involve the public somehow. I mean, we care. It's not just a matter of property rights or ownership. We as consumers of genetic information and providers of data, we want to be somehow involved, to come to the table. And we badly need further work on this by political philosophers, political scientists, anthropologists, sociologists, etc. And we're not starting from scratch. I mean, we have lots of social theories about solidarity which we can draw upon, sort of emphasizing the joint responsibilities. I just wanted to mention this stuff. I must admit that I've not been able to attend all the lectures because of all the commitments these days, but I see this as one of the key avenues to explore, to experiment with ways of governance and organization to involve the practitioners and the public. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gisli. I was just going to comment a little bit about what you mentioned here. If we're lowering the standards when we're implementing the translation of research, I can reflect a little bit on my previous work with the European Medicines Agency. I worked there. I'm not speaking on their behalf here, but and I don't work there anymore. But I had some experience there when pharmaceutical companies and other stakeholders wanted to implement new biomarkers in evaluating medicines or other resources. Then the process of evaluating biomarkers is a complicated step, and it is and should be highly regulated. It's not up to any individual companies or research institute to take this into this. This is scrutinized, and I think it's important to have that in mind, that people shouldn't go under the surveillance of these regulatory bodies of how things are done. And I think this should be, the same applies should be for the genetic markers we are using, or even if we can debate if it should be for each individual gene or gene marker, or the genome as a whole as a one-off test for everything. That's a debate that's have to come. But but this would probably be the same issue from FDA in the States, which is the equivalent body. Very conservative approach, I think, that they're taking there. I think we should.
We have several hands now. Several people have raised their hands. Karen first.
Just a small question.
Speak up a bit.
Yeah, sorry. Just a small question about severity. Who would, in practice, I don't know if you can say anything about this, it's just interesting to me, who would judge the severity of the incidental findings? Is that clear? In any way, do you think that you have a practice developed already that would make that easy to decide? We should actually decide the severity of how severe are these diseases. I guess we would like to, I guess you were saying that, and there was somebody else yesterday who was talking about that often we would of course discuss with a particular person in front of us, because the significance and the meaning of that an illness is highly individual.
Yeah.
But I was just wondering, who would judge where is the responsibility?
I think you may be referring to how did the American College come to the conclusion that there were 52 conditions. That's one of the reasons they went to the scrutiny of how to decide and when to decide. Is that?
I'm just sort of thinking about the democracy.
Thomas, do you have regulations about this, or?
It's a good question because I don't have the best answer.
Vigdís.
I have a small comment. I asked a practitioner how many doctors see people with hypercholesterolemia, and which is a year, and how many of them contact relatives with maybe a big risk? Nobody. So why would we contact people with hypercholesterolemia?
But sometimes, you hear, at least in the English countries, that often in the community of genetic counselors, if you have several people in the same practice, sometimes they would be faced with a real moral dilemma because we are, they're patients in the same clinic, and sometimes they would overrule the demand not to display these information to other family members. They would simply say, this is too severe. We can actually go in and save people, or we can, and they would sometimes overrule the confidentiality, in effect undermining the trust between the patient and or in principle or hypothetically.
I think there are more issues than not just the severity of the condition, it's also what can we do about it. And it comes to the talk by our Scottish friend yesterday, Donald, where you had these 4 things where you can do, there's something you can do about it, and you can diagnose, but what then? There are more issues than just the severity. It's also what can you do. So you have to have this. But then also you have to ask the counselees, the individuals, why would you want to know? Because we're doing genetic counseling in conditions that we know we can do nothing. It's deteriorating for the individuals, and it can be harmful for them to know because we know the high suicidal rate like a Huntington's condition. So we all have this there. So we have to listen to what are the reasons they are requesting these information. That's an important aspect as well.
Salvör?
Yeah, I just want to take up the comment from Peter also that, I think, for instance, here in Iceland, because we are talking about sort of the Icelandic is that, I think we should have a platform for a public dialogue that we could engage everybody in, all sort of different people from different disciplines. But because one of the lessons we should have drawn from the debate here 10, 15 years ago is that this polarized debate is not getting us anywhere. And it's really harmful in the long run. And I think, and because I was just mentioning this lack of studies, because I think it would be very interesting. Vilhjálmur was just briefly telling you about this, what the DCOD was doing in several months ago, trying to get people into studies, or they're trying to collect 100,000 people. And it seems that, you know, there were speculations, at least, about whether there is a diminished trust, or, you know, that people are not as willing now as they were maybe 10 years ago. These are only speculations. We don't really have data to show it. So we really badly need some more sort of social scientists to sort of to monitor, maybe just sort of regularly, you know, how this how people really react to the public media. And it would be very interesting, you know, you from social sciences, if we could really do more of this and sort of on a regular basis.
I would like to add to this a little bit because what I found, I think this is a very interesting research that's being done, and from a scientific point of view, I mean, why can't we just see science and scientific understanding, as I think came very clearly out from Albert. I mean, they're trying to understand heart disease and other diseases that, and it's not enough to as a valuable research to get understanding the old Aristotelian notion of the value of knowledge in itself. Why hype it up always as around the corner is the cure for serious diseases when there are no indications of that? Why don't we have a truthful discussion with the nation about science rather than hyping up all the time and launching a massive collection like this overnight? It's so impolite treatment of the nation. Why don't we discuss with the nation on the right terms?
That's a difficult thing to accomplish at times, because as a scientist or whatnot, you're competing for resources. You're trying to convince the government, the people to finance things, and you have, unfortunately, at times you have to play this game because you have to get your grants funded. You have to have the consensus to actually to get these things going on, and in an ideal world, you're absolutely right, but unfortunately, we don't live in an ideal world. And I don't know how to exactly solve that. But, the point's been made, and it was made particularly by Tim on Thursday. And I think it's important for scientists to engage publicly and try to explain things. But but still, you get the best headlines in the Daily Mail and whatnot, where you say, "I'm going to do this." That gets you the clickbait where people actually click your links. That's still a problem.
Christian, would you like to come with your question or comment on this?
Okay, I'm Christian Árnason. I'm a chairman of the Icelandic Bioethics Committee, and I'm a clinician at the University Hospital, and I do some other things also. I used to work with AGES-Reykjavik Genetics about 12 years ago when all the discussion was going on. As a chairman of the Icelandic Bioethics Committee, I want to comment on your discussion that we, in fact, agreed on this procedure that was done by AGES-Reykjavik Genetics. And the way you presented it, it's much too simple. Actually, it's much more complicated than you presented it. So I don't think it's fair to take up on the discussion here. But I just wanted to point out that the Ethics Committee agreed to this, and we have had no reason, after all the discussion, to revoke that. We still stand by that. But that was not my main point. The main point is that thank you very much for this very good morning. And I would like to comment on Tim Caulfield's summary, which I thought was excellent. And if you compare that to the objectives of the PopGen, the question arises, like Jón ended up with, how are you going to do it? How are you going to bring results into the clinic? And I think that's a very important thing, because discussion is fine, but discussion about evidence is even much better. So I think we need evidence, and I think that came very clearly from your overview, that the hype is, amongst other things, because we don't have evidence. And we've been discussing it here in Iceland to actually try to generate this evidence in our small way. And I think it's very important to use the resources that we have, the database, the banks, the biobanks, the and the public interest and all our scientists. So I think I would suggest that your objective here is a very good one. It's a very valid one. The question is how you're going to do it. I would suggest that we do that with collecting evidence.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing in your perspective on I was not trying to give any exhaustive description, of course, of the incident.
We certainly did.
Mention it. Let's move on with Björn Miska.
Yeah, thank you. I also think it is really interesting. It's a good event you made here. And I was thinking about, Tim was talking about this hyping, both of the benefits and the hyping of the risks. And that is, the hyping of the risk is a part of this LC community responsibility. And then we have this, I forgot your name, Gisli, was it? Your comment saying that we want to be involved in governance. And this we, I'm a bit unsure if there is evidence for this we that want to be involved in governance. And I think that is an important issue because I've read some of the studies on people's motivation for participating, and quite a few people seem to say that they want to contribute, but they don't want to be involved in governing. What they want is someone trustworthy governing this. So people just don't really, or a lot of people don't want to really be involved in governance. And I think that is also something for us to reflect on. How should we put up the governance, and who should be involved, and on what basis? Because I think the general public feel the pressure to participate in everything, and we don't want that. And now I'm speaking of me as the we. I think it's good leaving it to someone who is competent and has that as a dedicated thing. So yeah, thank you.
You, Eric?
I would like to go back to this tremendous readiness of Icelanders to participate in research that you described earlier. Perhaps I'm the older one, but I can't help feeling a little bit sort of nervous about that. I mean, if you want to be positive about it, of course you can see it as an expression of solidarity and trust in the healthcare system. And it's of course also a tremendous resource for research, and that's a very good thing. But if you want to be a little bit more suspicious, it doesn't raise some sort of questions whether people actually taking risks and disadvantages of research seriously. Are they unduly under the influence of hype? Or are they in some ways sort of pressured? You mentioned a quite sort of offensive way of, very active way of recruiting participants. So maybe there's no sort of justification for such suspicion, but I just want to raise that as kind of general reflection.
Maybe we say, what is the harm of participating as a whole? Is there any? We have a law on genetic discrimination. It's forbidden to use genetic discrimination in Iceland by law. I think that's correct. And we have some examples from the insurance industry on that. But the next.
I think we have a comment from Martin. Martin, sorry.
Yeah, just a brief comment, maybe a question for Tim, because going back to the discrimination issue, I think it's quite obvious that the reason why some people are pushing for non-discrimination in the area of genetics rather than blood pressure is that you know it's a product. We think that it's a product of your own actions, right? In the field of blood pressure. But interestingly, if we were to move on to a broader omics approach, like the medical selfie that you mentioned yesterday, it would incorporate more sort of the experience of people, the bad habits and so on. In that case, it would obviously change. So that might happen sooner than we think. I think. So that's one point. The other is that the reason why we're not seeing any discrimination is that genetic data is not very accessible yet, I think. I think this is, and we're still to see whether it is going to be accessible to ordinary people. Right now, I think very few people know anything about their DNA in Denmark at least. Maybe it's different in Canada. The 23andMe now in your country. But,
Good comment? Yeah, these are excellent points. The thing with blood, I think blood pressure is a very interesting one because looking for the geneticists in the room, I think blood pressure is like 80% genetic. I think it's very high. Yeah, so it's actually is a genetic marker, right? In some ways, it's a phenotypic expression of perhaps, right? So, and there's a lot of.
I think you're hyping that.
Yeah. Okay, 60%. So it is this sort of representation of, but I agree with you. One of the reasons that one of the reasons we're not seeing genetic discrimination, I think it's because insurance companies don't want it. It's useless. Like they'd rather ask what their parents died of, they'd rather have your blood pressure, and they'd rather have your weight, right? So and then what's fascinating is once it becomes predictive. So let's say, and I bet you this is what's happened in these situations where there has been genetic discrimination. Under Canadian law, there ought to have been discrimination because the insurance law says you can use information that is medically relevant. So if it does become, I always think the anti-discrimination, genetic discrimination laws is really a critique of the insurance industry. People are frustrated with the insurance industry, and if you get a referral to a genetic counselor, that's got to be disclosed. And if a genetic counselor says, don't tell your insurance, you better get your insurance. That's actually, I sound like a lawyer now. That would be a non-disclosure that would vitiate the insurance contract. So I think it invites a discussion about insurance more broadly. What kind of risks, as a society, we want to be part of the insurance discussion. And the same thing for employment and blah, blah, blah down the line.
Just one short answer. Without genetic counselors, now you don't have to disclose that. But
Can't hear you.
If you're visiting a doctor,
oh yeah. So in Canada, once you're getting your contract, they can ask you anything they want. It's a private contract, and so if they say they could ask you that, and if you say, yeah.
Stefan, do you want to comment on this, or I'm not?
I'm not on this topic actually. So
we have also Árnason. Okay, then we take that.
Yeah. So thanks. I agree entirely with the emphasis on the data, and as a geneticist, I just have to comment. So we're talking about the genetics of complex traits. So the complexity lies in the name of the beast, and of course we're going to find some fraction of genes or mutations that are going to have high predictive power, and it makes sense that we find a way of utilizing that. But also, I want to stress what Albert was saying, that even the weak genes, they will tell us some biology that we eventually may be able to use, not necessarily in a clinical setting, but just understanding the disease. But I also want to so we're struggling with the present. There's a lot of things happening in the present, but I want us to look to the future because technology is marching on, and like Morten was saying, maybe in 10 years we'll be able to sequence ourselves or whomever we encounter, and that stuff is going to go online. And we talk about biobanks as being extremely secure and people have trust in them, but one of them is going to get busted, and the stuff is going to get posted. So I'm not trying to paint like a dark picture, but the future is going to be a whole lot different from the present, and we have to think about that too.
I think in that context is that the Minister of Health just launched the direct patient access into primary health care database. Did you hear me? Sorry. They asked me to speak louder. I'm like Vigdís. I usually speak in a smaller crowd. It's that we recently opened up on one of the primary healthcare center that patients can have a direct access to the records. So this is where we are going. There will be a direct access, and if the genome is going to be a part of your healthcare system, they will be able to access it there. So we have to think about the future, and I'm totally agree with you, because it's so fast. Although we think it's too slow, but it's actually very fast.
And there hasn't been any critical, ethical, social or legal, I think, discussion of this in Iceland. And I have always tended to see this as a beneficial thing, but I may be missing something, and perhaps someone will point out. Jón?
Just a couple of comments, I think. I think we're going to be for quite some time in an era where the generation of information is much faster than our ability to prove it's beneficial or not. We just have to have a system to deal with that. It happens in every aspect of our practice. One aspect, for instance, is usually now, if you want to do some clinical laboratory testing, including genetic testing, you need to have equipment that's approved by the FDA if you're in the US, or with CE marking if it's in Europe. Now that takes years. And in genetics, the companies typically don't do that. And if you ask them why, they say, by the time we have the license, this technology is outdated. So whatever we do, we're going to have to live with that. That we're always going to be working with information where we don't know whether it's beneficial or not. To prove something is beneficial may take years or decades or even generations. So we always have to work with something with benefits clear. There has to be a judgment call based on science and clinical experience. The second is, I think right now, genetics or genomics technologies have proven very beneficial for rare diseases, beneficial for malignant disease, leukemias, and cancer. That's beyond doubt in my mind. It's not clear how or if it's beneficial for the average person with average complex disease. That's where we are right now. But then, this is a matter of perspective. It really is. If you want to observe the first flight of the Wright brothers, do you see the failure or the potential? I mean, I think the potential is there for genomic medicine. But, we're at the stage, we're at the very early stage when the crash is more easy to see. But we have to keep that channel open and have to move forward to see, to further examine when is this beneficial, what parts of the genome are beneficial to study, under what settings. Do you think that really should be one of the central messages from this workshop?
Can I comment a little bit on this, on how fast this is moving? We saw the data from Albert here, which is something comes from the genome-wide association studies, which is very good to see what's happening on a population basis, but it has a very limited meaning for the individuals. But it has been progressed. Now we have the sequencing, which is much more detailed approach and has much more predictive value for the individual, not for the population. And this is something like if you look for the X-rays, that if you look at this, the genome-wide association is just like an old standard X-ray picture, but the genome sequencing is like the MRI, which is much more detailed and gives you much more information about what you have, and you are looking at them. So we're moving very fast. So we have this technology, and it's not the genome-wide association which we can criticize that they don't have the individual predictive power. It's the new technology that's coming up that we need to emphasize, and that's what it is.
Well, actually, along the same line about the future, in the Danish Ethical Council, we often discuss that we are lagging behind. The technology is moving so fast, and ethics is coming behind. So sometimes you need to speculate and try to see what will happen in the future. Of course, there's a difficulty relating to the height, but still, somebody has to discuss what will the implications be.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, it's extremely interesting discussions, and in fact, I get more and more confused.
That's good.
But the problem as I see it is that we have this tremendous hype
as we have been presented over and over again. And we have more and more information. And it's going really fast. And I agree with Arna is that we are really heading for a world where we know a lot about the genome. But now, if we look at even clinicians, highly educated people, there's only a small fraction of them who understands what this is all about. And if you look at the population, it's completely, and whatever you say, you try to explain to people very carefully, and they get completely the wrong idea very often. And these are often highly educated people. So I mean, I'm a little bit, I don't know how we're going to, we don't want to have a society where there's sort of, very specialized knowledge somewhere and the population doesn't know anything. We also want to preserve our health systems. It's very different. When Tim is talking about, North America is very different from, at least from the Nordic countries.
And UK.
And the UK, not to forget, I should remember the UK better than anybody else. But anyway, but this is an important issue. We don't want this to deteriorate and become some sort of, it's very interesting when we talk about Angelina Jolie, because that was, had tremendous effect on everybody, I suppose, all women at least, all women in the world now know that there is something very interesting going on there, and you should be aware of that, so on and so forth. But she could do things which most American women, or at least sort of the average American woman, didn't have very good access to. Very good medical care and reconstruction, etc., etc., etc. So it's kind of, and I really liked your comment, Tim, on your being sitting next table and nobody, everybody knows her, obviously, and I think this, it's a very positive thing about our society. Yes. We are so kind of, I don't know, maybe naive, but also we don't want to make a fuss about these things.
But isn't that in part because Iceland's just a small place and everyone's a celebrity in a way? You know a lot of people, and you just see people all the time. It's like, oh, Bjork, it's like whatever. It's just, you see people you recognize in all kinds of contexts.
It happens in the UK as well. That phenomenon will also have happened in the UK, where the celebrity would not have got mobbed.
No? I think that's...
Oh, okay. That counters what I just said.
I think UK is a good place, and Scotland is probably better.
Stefan.
I wanted to follow up on the topic of evidence, the plea for evidence, and the reflections people have had about the difficulties. Jón saying that we will have to live with the situation that there will be an avalanche of information and we will be lagging behind. I don't know if it was you, Jón, who said that ethics has been lagging behind and we will be lagging behind. That's one part of it, but the evidence for clinical benefit, it does not come that easily. And I really think Albert demonstrated this very, very clearly with his combining. There was a lot of enthusiasm in your presentation with all the data you are generating and putting out into the public domain, and it's wonderful. And then you combine that with this, what I would call a nice humility about, this is research. It's not having a clinical impact today or tomorrow, and it's not even necessarily within your field to do the research that is needed to translate it into the clinic. So, that's a fine way of being enthusiastic about science without hyping the clinical impact in the close future. But we need translational research. We need evidence. I don't think we don't think it's ethically correct to give up on the demand for evidence of clinical benefit. And I think that's part of the progress in modern medicine, that we are being more clear that we shouldn't implement without evidence of benefit. We should not implement on the basis of enthusiasm and good intentions, at least not without making sure that we implement in a way that allows us to do research, get data. I mean, the results will come afterwards, but I mean, that's what is happening in the screening, mammography and PSA screening. We have designed the protocols for implementation in a way that now it's giving us some evidence about the benefits that we have been hoping for decades. We've been believing in it a lot, but we still did design the implementation protocols in a way that allows us now to judge better what is the benefit versus the costs and even harms of some of the screening cases. I wanted to point out two areas where evidence is strongly needed. The one is in a single gene, rather simple with high clinical relevance, obviously, and that's in the BRCA1 that we did hear earlier today, that in Iceland the penetrance is probably low, and we need data on that, and we need data on what are the benefits of disclosing, for example, disclosing in families without a history of breast cancer. Without knowing that, we don't know how to use these data. That's rather simple. It's rather simple to design the research to give us.
I'm actually doing it.
Good. But we are also talking about a much more complex area with the common and complex diseases where there are promises for giving people risk profiles, personalized medicine, tailoring lifestyle advice, tailoring preventive medicine, and we need evidence on the pros and cons there, and we haven't got much of that yet. And it's not that easy to design the studies that will give us the evidence, and the commercial companies that are operating in this field today, like 23andMe, they may not be so interested in producing that evidence, because they probably know that as far or as short as we have come today, there probably isn't going to be an awful lot of clinical benefit. But that does not mean we shouldn't look for evidence for it, because there's a lot of hype about personalized medicine. So we need to research that area as well.
One comment, if I may, because it was part of, I think, against my comment. I totally agree. I think evidence is important. I just think the world we live in has this discrepancy between scientific and technology progress and information gathering and the time span it takes to obtain evidence. We have to deal with that. What are we going to do in that sense?
I would like to
evidence is important, absolutely.
take this a little bit further. If you look at the situation in Iceland, what we are seeing here is that I noticed from the panel yesterday, someone mentioned that we are generating health information. I think that was confused what comes from out of the biobanks or the research is health information. And they mentioned that there were two ways to go in. There are two resources. In Iceland, there are actually three. I forgot to mention the third one. The first one was that what comes from individual studies, which are research, and then we have the biobanks from the hospitals that comes in, and you're not asked. And it is decided, and we also have in Iceland, we have the third one, which is from imputed genetic data, from combining health information and genetic information that has been imputed. So we actually have three resources that comes in here, and now I think we have for the whole population. We can do some imputation for the whole population with different accuracy, could you say? The data is, I don't know what the quality, but in general it's good. So we need to address this, and that's where I totally agree with Christian. Is that we need to generate the evidence how we're going to use this, and we cannot just discuss this over and over again. We have to come up with research plans, like Stefan is saying, and we need to get the stakeholders to come together. And that's where I think, what was the question I put to Jóhannes, is the role of the national health system. What is the role of them in generating this? And I think it's very important to build on what we have, and the experience of contacting people, working with the genetic information as a healthcare information. I think that it is, from the healthcare professional, working with healthcare information is a little bit different from the research lab that is working with, even though it's headed by a clinician or something. So this needs to be combined, and I think that the take-home is we need to get the stakeholders in. So, sorry, I'm a bit passionate, but I think that's something we need to work on. And maybe you can generate better data than you presented, although I think in many cases we will actually end up that we will find a lot of this is not better than the scale to step on in the morning and see how much we're going to eat for a day. But in many cases, I think it's going to be important, and this is going to be, however we're going to, the wagon is going, we're not going to stop it. We have to work on it.
Well, I shouldn't continue on this rather. I was just looking for a comment because of the low penetrance of BRC1. We don't really have very much information on BRC1 because it's extremely rare. These mutations are very, very rare yet. But we have much more information on the BRCA2. And I certainly would not say that it's low penetrance.
No.
But what I want to say, and nobody really, well, I mean, I need to prove this extremely well, is that we have very varied penetrance. And very varied penetrance, and this is a very important thing for the whole spectrum that we're talking about, because this is an early truncation mutation which completely ruins the protein. There's no protein produced. We studied that thoroughly, and there's a sort of death sequence that comes, so there is no protein there. So this should be very clean, and we have the same mutation, all inherited from the same ancestor some way back. And yet, you have in some families very high penetrance, in others you don't. And you have different types of cancer, very different types of cancer. Some of the families are really like prostate cancer families. Others are no prostate cancers, etc., etc. And I'm just talking about the carriers. And so I think this is a lesson that even with these highly penetrant and important genes, you have this variation.
Stefan, you want to comment?
Just a brief comment. This is extremely important. It's scientifically fascinating and sort of important to pursue, but it also downstream important in terms of how to manage patients, the families, and persons with some of the genetic variants without a family history. So we need that at all levels.
We will be drawing to a close. There's only one hand that I still have marked, but if you are sort of closing in with burning questions, let me know, or us further.
Yes. While we're waiting for time to give you my point, you mentioned the imputed, the resource of imputed research regarding individuals in the population. I just wanted to point out that that's in a little bit of a legal loophole, because imputing research results for individuals that haven't participated, and in this case for the whole population, it has no legal basis for the processing. So the result which was reached with the researcher in question, which is Decode, was that they were allowed, this happened last winter, to impute on the whole population, but only for processing. So they're not allowed to provide this as a pool to be used for research, but only for intermittent calculations, and so there's a problem there actually for them, because they will then have a problem when they have to reproduce this for verification. But that was just my quick point. The big one was maybe that what I think is maybe a little bit lacking from this. We've gone from discussing the autonomy, the consent, and the control, etc., all the way through to how we then could possibly use whatever comes out of this in a clinical setting. But we haven't really looked at what's changing in the paradigm of research. What's changing in the paradigm of medical research is that the resources we're going from the paradigm of conducting research where we have a beginning, a work on the pool of raw materials, and then an end, and then a discardment of that material, which basically is information, as Tim pointed out yesterday. So these pools of information, they have ceased being in this paradigm. They are now becoming permanent databases. All our researches are more or less moving into becoming databases. And there's a rapidly diminishing part of those databases that are then discarded, or they live on. We've had the new legislation here in Iceland, which was enacted this year and is coming into effect this winter, which basically has the stated goal of cutting down on the instances where you have to destroy information that have previously been worked on, whether or not they were gathered for research purposes to begin with. But I think this is an important thing, because we're constantly referring to, and we've done this today and yesterday, we're referring to concepts and thinking that was based in this old paradigm of beginning and end of a research project. We really aren't there anymore, and we're definitely not going to be there tomorrow.
I think I can add to that is that, for example, in I think the new legislation has been in the other on the biobanks is for if you are a pharmaceutical company and you're collecting data, you have a minimum of 15 years study period, and you should keep your data for 15 years, while the individual researchers, like in bioscience, it's only 5 years. So there's a clear difference, a discrimination between these communities, and I think that's strange. And if you see what are the pharmaceutical companies asking for when they ask to store genetic material, there's not much they're requested in the informed consent. It's just that if they need to do something later on, they can store the data. So we need to address this.
Just a very quick follow there. Well, the basis in the new legislation is to distinguish between these fundamental research on people, as they're called, and research on data. And in the research on data, there's really no relation to how the data came into being. We just have a constantly deepening pool of data which are going to live forever.
Christian? Yeah, just shortly point out as a clinician and a researcher that some of the material that was shown here this morning was an old-fashioned way of imputation. Making all those family trees and calculating that this guy would have this and this and this, and certainly I'll bet some of the data that you showed. We've never had any problems with it, and as far as I know, over the last 20 years, no patient or participant has had any problem or harm done to him because of our methods.
Yes, that's right. We use in genetic counseling, we use imputation almost every day. So that's clear.
We will be going to close. Perhaps, I mean, there have been very interesting themes. I think the one that has been very dominant is the theme of evidence and the need to generate evidence, and perhaps differences in well, how quickly we move before we have the evidence, and and of course the discourse. I think the discourse around this is, because that was the main theme of the beginning talk by Tim Caulfield here on Thursday, was I didn't see it as a criticism of genetics or genetic research, but a criticism of the discourse, of the hype and the promises, and how that feeds into the hopeful citizenry that, of course, we are psychologically constituted in such a way that we are hoping always for cure of serious diseases, and this is being exploited. Unless we have evidence for it. And I mean, I think, I hope that no one disagrees on I mean, I think we have been sort of talking along these lines. And another thing that has been, is I think, the comments from both Gisli and Jóhannes sort of having to do with the kind of society that we want to build, and that we are not eroding both the trust and the solidarity that has characterized our sort of mentality. And I think the point made by Eric about whether the willingness of the Icelandic nation to participate in research, which I think is a valuable resource. I mean, I think, well, we need to at least treat this resource in a very sort of careful way, and not. I think the hyping discourse is one rather risky way to treat it. So, well, I have the last word, apparently. And I just want to thank you all for this whole event. This was a cluster of events, beginning with the talk on Thursday, the Center for Ethics invited Tim Caulfield to report, and then the PopGen events on Friday morning and this morning, and the Nordic Bioethics Committee in the afternoon. I hope that we have all experienced certain sort of red threads in all these events, and that we will find this valuable input in our reflections on these issues. Thank you very much.